It's Sunday morning in Birmingham, Alabama, 1995. 60,000 messengers, that's what the Southern Baptist Convention calls its voting members, pack into the cavernous Civic Center, voices rising in familiar hymns that have echoed through this organization for 150 years. The energy is electric. This is America's largest Protestant denomination at its absolute zenith. 15.9 million members wielding cultural power that shapes presidential elections, dominates the Bible Belt, and defines evangelical Christianity for much of the world. Flash forward to a Sunday morning today. That same church you're imagining? There's a decent chance it's now a coffee shop, a CrossFit gym, or sitting empty with broken windows and an overgrown parking lot. What happened between then and now isn't just a story about religion. It's a case study in how the mightiest institutions can crumble, not with a bang, but with a whisper. The Southern Baptist Convention hasn't disappeared. It still exists. It still claims millions of members. But something fundamental has broken inside it, and the fractures are only now becoming impossible to ignore. Let me take you back to where this really begins, because every collapse has a hidden genesis point, that moment when the first hairline crack appears in the foundation. For the Southern Baptist Convention, we need to go back to 1845. Yes, you heard that right. The original sin, quite literally, was sin itself, or rather humanity's oldest moral failing, the willingness to defend the indefensible when it serves your interests. The Southern Baptist Convention was born from a schism, a split from Northern Baptists over one issue: slavery. Southern Baptists wanted to send slave-holding missionaries abroad. Northern Baptists said no. So, on May 8, 1845, in Augusta, Georgia, 293 delegates from Southern churches gathered and formed their own convention. They would spend the next 150 years building an empire on a foundation laid, quite explicitly, to defend the ownership of human beings. That history matters. It's not ancient history or irrelevant backstory, it's the DNA. By the mid-20th century, the Southern Baptist Convention had grown into a colossus. It had distanced itself from its pro-slavery origins, though it wouldn't officially apologize for supporting slavery until 1995, exactly 150 years later. By then, the SBC operated the largest Protestant missionary force on earth, ran 6 seminaries, controlled a publishing empire through Lifeway Christian Resources, and could claim 1 out of every 5 Protestant churchgoers in America sat in a Southern Baptist pew. The convention was so influential that when a Southern Baptist governor from Arkansas named Mike Huckabee or a Southern Baptist peanut farmer from Georgia named Jimmy Carter ran for president, their religious affiliation wasn't a footnote. It was central to their identity and appeal. Billy Graham, though not officially SBC leadership, was closely aligned and became America's pastor. The convention shaped the moral majority, influenced the Reagan Revolution, and became synonymous with evangelical political power. But here's where the story gets interesting. Power doesn't corrupt institutions the way we think it does. Power doesn't usually create scandals out of whole cloth. What power does is expose what was always there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we dig into the stories that shape our world, the hidden collapses and quiet revolutions that happen while we're all looking the other way. If you're getting value from what we do here, consider hitting that super thanks button. It genuinely helps us keep researching and producing these deep dives. Now I'm curious, where are you watching this from and what's your profession? Drop a comment. I read them all and I'm fascinated by who finds these stories compelling. The first tremor that most people didn't notice came in the 1980s and 90s during something called the conservative resurgence. If you weren't paying attention, and most Americans weren't, this looked like an internal theological dispute. Moderates versus conservatives, inerrancy of Scripture, academic freedom in seminaries, yawn, right? Wrong. This was a brutal, decades-long civil war for control of every institution the SBC controlled. The conservatives won, decisively. By the early 1990s, they controlled the presidency of the convention, all 6 seminary presidencies and the mission boards. Moderate voices were systematically purged. Professors who questioned literal six-day creation or suggested historical context for biblical interpretation were fired. Entire seminary faculties were replaced. The takeover was so complete that by 2000, the SBC adopted a revised Baptist faith and message that declared wives should submit graciously to their husbands and barred women from serving as senior pastors. Here's what's crucial. This wasn't just about theology. It was about control, about who gets to define orthodoxy and who gets cast out. And when you build a culture where questioning authority equals questioning God, you create the perfect conditions for abuse to flourish in darkness. The numbers started shifting around 2006. That year, the SBC reported 16.3 million members, its all-time peak. Then something strange happened. The numbers started falling. Slowly at first, a couple 100,000 here, 100,000 there. By 2020, membership had dropped below 14 million for the first time since the mid-1980s. By 2023, it had fallen to 13.2 million, a loss of 3 million members in less than 2 decades. But raw membership numbers don't tell the whole story because of something insiders call the membership rolls scandal. Southern Baptist churches have notoriously inflated membership because they count anyone who ever joined and hasn't been formally removed. People who moved away decades ago, people who died and no one updated the records, people who left the faith entirely but never asked to be removed. Some estimates suggest that actual active participation is less than half of claimed membership. The more telling number is baptisms. In Baptist theology, baptism is crucial. It's the public declaration of faith the moment someone joins the church. It's also how the convention grows since Baptists don't baptize infants. In 2023, Southern Baptist churches reported their lowest number of baptisms since 1944. Think about that. 1944. The country had 132 million people then. Today it has 335 million. The population has more than doubled, but the SBC is baptizing fewer people than they did when America was fighting World War II. Churches are closing at an accelerating rate. In 2022 alone, the SBC lost a net of 457 churches. Not 457 churches closed, 457 more closed than opened. And these aren't just small rural churches, though plenty of those are dying as young people flee small towns. These are established churches in suburbs and cities, some with histories stretching back a century. Then came the summer of 2022, and the dam broke. On May 22, 2022, an investigative firm called Guidepost Solutions released a 288-page report that ripped away the veil and exposed what many survivors had been screaming about for years. The Southern Baptist Convention had systematically covered up sexual abuse. The details were horrifying. For 2 decades, leaders in the SBC's executive committee had maintained a secret list of more than 700 abusive pastors and other church workers. They knew. They had names, dates, and testimonies, and they did worse than nothing. They actively worked to hide the abuse and protect the abusers. They intimidated survivors who came forward. They recommended accused pastors to other churches without warning anyone. They prioritized protecting the institution's reputation over protecting children and vulnerable adults. One name that emerged was Johnny Hunt, a former SBC president, accused of sexually assaulting another pastor's wife. Another was Paige Patterson, an architect of the conservative resurgence, who had allegedly told women in abusive marriages to pray more and submit to their husbands rather than leave. He was also accused of covering up rape at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary while serving as president. The response from the top was damning. Russell Moore, who served as head of the SBC's Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, had been trying to get leaders to address the abuse crisis for years. He was marginalized, attacked, and ultimately left the SBC in 2021, saying the abuse crisis revealed that there are people who are hearing the names of the sexual abuse survivors and the credible accusations and are angry, not at the sexual abuse, not at the cover-up, but at the people who are talking about the sexual abuse and the cover-up. Think about that logic. The problem isn't the abuse. The problem is people talking about the abuse. The Guidepost report revealed conversations where executive committee members discussed how to minimize legal liability, how to avoid creating a database that could be subpoenaed, how to protect the base, meaning the churches and donors, from information that might upset them. In one particularly chilling email chain, staffers joked about a survivor advocate, calling her demeaning names and mocking her efforts to create an abuse prevention task force. The scandal went nuclear in the media. Secular news outlets that hadn't paid attention to the SBC in years suddenly ran front-page stories. Survivor advocacy groups that had been ignored were suddenly being interviewed on national television. And inside the convention, the response was fractured and revealing. Some churches immediately began implementing reforms, background checks, training programs, survivor support systems. Others insisted the whole thing was overblown, that the secular media was attacking Christians, that this was spiritual warfare designed to weaken the church. Several prominent pastors suggested that focusing too much on abuse was a distraction from the gospel. The 2022 annual meeting in Anaheim was explosive. Messengers passed reforms, including creating a database of credibly accused abusers and establishing an abuse reform implementation task force. It felt like progress. It felt like the institution might actually change. But here's the thing about institutional reform. It requires sustained will, resources, and accountability. Within a year, the implementation was already stalling. Churches complained about costs and legal liability. The database rollout faced technical and theological challenges. Remember, Baptist churches are autonomous, and many resist any form of denominational authority. Some pastors preached against the reforms, calling them worldly solutions to spiritual problems. By 2023, several churches had left the SBC specifically because they opposed the abuse reforms. One megachurch pastor said the reforms gave too much power to woke elements trying to destroy biblical masculinity. The signal was clear. For a significant portion of the SBC, protecting the institution's traditional power structures mattered more than protecting victims. This is where the financial picture becomes crucial. Lifeway Christian Resources, the SBC's publishing arm that had been a cash cow for decades, closed all its physical stores in 2019. The organization had lost $36 million over the previous 4 years as Christian retail shifted online and younger evangelicals moved away from traditional devotional materials. By 2021, Lifeway was operating on a skeleton crew, a shadow of its former influence. The International Mission Board, which had once deployed over 5,600 missionaries worldwide, had to recall hundreds of missionaries in 2015 due to a budget shortfall exceeding $200 million. By 2023, the missionary force had dropped below 3,600. The cooperative program, the unified budget that funds SBC entities through church contributions, has been declining for years as churches either leave the convention or redirect their missions giving to organizations they trust more. Meanwhile, the culture war politics that the SBC had invested so heavily in was yielding diminishing returns. The convention had tied itself closely to the Republican Party and to specific political positions on everything from abortion to immigration to LGBTQ rights. This wasn't new. The SBC had been politically conservative since the mid-20th century. But something shifted in the Trump era. When Russell Moore and other SBC leaders expressed reservations about Donald Trump's character during the 2016 campaign, they faced ferocious backlash from the pews. Churches threatened to withhold funding. Pastors received angry calls. The message was clear. Political loyalty trumped theological concerns. Moore later wrote about receiving death threats from people who identified as Southern Baptists for suggesting Christians should think carefully about their political choices. This created a bizarre inversion. The SBC had spent decades arguing that America needed to return to biblical values. But when leaders tried to apply biblical ethics to political choices, they were told to shut up and support the Republican candidate. The institution had become so entangled with political power that it had lost the ability to speak prophetically to that power. Younger evangelicals noticed. Surveys showed that Christians under 40 were increasingly uncomfortable with the way evangelical institutions had become subsidiaries of the Republican Party. Many began identifying as evangelical in theology, but rejecting the label because of its political associations. The SBC, which had always depended on generational continuity, children raised in the faith, staying in the faith, was losing that pipeline. Then came the racial reckoning of 2020. The murder of George Floyd sparked nationwide protests and uncomfortable conversations about race in America. The SBC had elected its first black president, Fred Luter, in 2012, and it seemed like progress. But when black pastors and members began speaking out about racial justice in 2020, the response from many white SBC churches was hostile. The term critical race theory became a catch-all boogeyman, used to dismiss any conversation about systemic racism or America's racial history. Several prominent black pastors left the SBC saying they could no longer remain in a convention that seemed more concerned about culture war rhetoric than racial justice. Dwight McKissick, a black pastor in Texas, withdrew his church from the SBC after the convention, seemed to reject his resolution condemning white supremacy because of concerns about CRT language. The numbers tell the story. In the 1990s, the SBC had launched a major initiative to become more diverse. By 2020, about 20% of SBC churches were predominantly non-white, real progress in a historically white denomination. But the post-2020 exodus reversed some of those gains. When Black and Latino churches leave, they don't just take their members. They take their credibility, their witness against the SBC's racist history, their moral authority. Complementarianism, the belief that men and women have different but complementary roles with men as leaders in church and home, became another flashpoint. The SBC had doubled down on male-only senior pastors in the 2000 Baptist Faith and Message revision. But by the 2020s, this position was causing serious problems. In 2023, the convention formally disfellowshipped Saddleback Church, one of the largest and most influential churches in America, founded by Rick Warren, author of The Purpose-Driven Life, one of the best-selling Christian books of all time. Their crime? Ordaining women as pastors. Fern Creek Baptist Church in Louisville was also removed for having a woman pastor. The convention was willing to expel churches with thousands of members over this issue, sending a clear message. Doctrinal purity on gender roles matters more than numerical strength. This baffled outside observers and even some insiders. The SBC was hemorrhaging members and closing churches, and its response was to kick out some of its most successful congregations. But the logic made sense within the framework of the conservative resurgence. Control the definition of orthodoxy, even if it means becoming smaller and more ideologically uniform. The irony is that women have always done the majority of actual ministry work in Southern Baptist churches. They teach children, run missions programs, organize community outreach, lead Bible studies, serve as secretaries and administrators. They can do everything except hold the title of senior pastor. This increasingly struck younger members as arbitrary and unjust, contributing to the exodus of women and families from SBC churches. Throughout all of this, social media accelerated every trend. Abuse survivors who once had no platform could share their stories on Twitter and build support networks. Investigative journalists could crowdsource information and break stories that would have been buried a generation ago. But social media also amplified the culture war rhetoric, spread conspiracy theories, and created echo chambers where the most extreme voices got the most attention. SBC pastors found themselves in an impossible position. If they preached gentle, grace-focused messages, they were accused of being woke and soft. If they preached hardline culture war sermons, they alienated thoughtful members and visitors. If they tried to stay out of politics, both sides attacked them for cowardice. Many of the best pastors, thoughtful, compassionate, skilled communicators, just left. Some went to non-denominational churches, some left ministry entirely. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated everything. Churches that were already struggling with attendance faced a choice: close temporarily and pivot to online services, or stay open and risk public health. This became immediately politicized. Mask mandates and vaccine discussions split congregations. Pastors who closed their churches were accused of lacking faith. Pastors who stayed open were accused of endangering their flocks. No matter what choice they made, someone was furious. When churches reopened, many people just didn't come back. The pandemic had broken the habit of weekly attendance. People who had been going to church more out of social obligation than conviction realized they didn't miss it. Families who had been attending for their kids' sake discovered that sleeping in on Sunday was actually nice. The churches that survived were often those that had built genuine community, not just weekly attendance. The financial pressure intensified. Churches rely on tithing, giving 10% of income, but that practice has been declining for years. By some estimates, only about 10 to 25% of regular attendees actually tithe. When attendance drops by 30% post-pandemic and giving rates remain low, churches can't pay their pastors, can't maintain their buildings, can't fund their programs. Small and mid-sized churches are in a death spiral. Declining attendance leads to budget cuts, which leads to reduced programming, which leads to more people leaving. Add to this the fact that younger generations have completely different giving patterns. Millennials and Gen Z are drowning in student debt and struggling with housing costs in a way their parents weren't. The idea of giving 10% of their income to an institution, any institution, seems absurd. And when that institution is embroiled in abuse scandals and culture war politics they disagree with, forget it. The seminary system is in crisis too. Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, once the largest seminary in the world with over 5,000 students, had enrollment drop below 2,000. Faculty positions were eliminated. Buildings stood empty. Similar stories at other SBC seminaries. Why? Fewer young people feel called to ministry in an institution that seems to be imploding. Those who do feel called increasingly go to non-denominational seminaries or online programs, and many simply can't afford seminary. 3 years of education to prepare for a job that might pay $40,000 a year doesn't make financial sense. Here's a detail that should terrify SBC leadership. The average age of a Southern Baptist pastor is rising. More pastors are retiring than entering ministry. Rural churches can't find pastors at all and are relying on bivocational pastors who work full-time jobs and preach on weekends, or on retired pastors willing to come out of retirement for a small church that can barely pay them. The pipeline is broken. Some have tried to paint this as a crisis of secularism, America turning away from God, coastal elites attacking Christian values, the spiritual warfare of the end times. There's an element of truth in the secularization narrative. America is less religious than it was. Knowns, people who claim no religious affiliation, are the fastest growing religious category, especially among young adults. But that's not the whole story. Non-denominational evangelical churches are often thriving. Pentecostal and charismatic churches are growing, especially in immigrant communities. Even some mainline Protestant denominations that everyone said were dying have stabilized. It's not that Americans have abandoned Christianity. It's that they've abandoned institutions that seem more interested in power and control than in actually following Jesus. The Southern Baptist Convention is facing what business consultants call a death spiral. Decline begets more decline. As the institution weakens, it becomes more defensive and controlling, which accelerates the exodus of moderate voices, which makes it more extreme, which drives out more people. Meanwhile, the financial resources to reverse course are evaporating. The talented leaders who might reform the system are leaving or being pushed out. Some churches have tried to have it both ways, remaining nominally affiliated with the SBC for historical or sentimental reasons, while functionally operating as independent churches. They don't send much money to the cooperative program. They don't send messengers to the annual meeting. They might use Baptist in their name, but they've mentally and practically divorced themselves from the convention. This creates a hollowed-out institution that looks bigger on paper than it actually is. What's fascinating is how preventable this was. At multiple points, leaders could have chosen a different path. After the conservative resurgence, they could have sought reconciliation instead of total victory. When abuse survivors first came forward, they could have believed them and created accountability. When younger members started leaving, they could have listened to why. When the culture war rhetoric started alienating people, They could have remembered that Jesus said his kingdom was not of this world. But at every decision point, they chose short-term power over long-term health. They chose ideological purity over inclusion. They chose protecting the institution over protecting people. And now they're reaping that harvest. The broader implications are significant. The Southern Baptist Convention was the backbone of the religious right. Its decline represents a fundamental shift in American evangelicalism and American politics. Politicians who once courted SBC approval now have to navigate a more fragmented landscape. The cultural power that evangelicals wielded from the 1980s through the 2010s is waning, not because America became hostile to Christianity, but because the institutions squandered their moral authority. There's a question hanging over all of this. Can the Southern Baptist Convention be saved? Some insiders say yes. They point to reform efforts, to younger leaders who seem more humble and compassionate, to churches that are genuinely trying to change culture and address abuse and focus on the gospel instead of politics. They note that institutions can reinvent themselves, that renewal movements have happened before. But the pessimists point to the structural problems. The SBC is built on autonomous churches voluntarily cooperating, which means there's no mechanism to enforce real accountability. The people most committed to staying in the SBC are often the most resistant to change. The financial resources needed for a real turnaround may no longer exist, and the cultural moment may have passed. Younger evangelicals are building new kinds of communities that don't look like the SBC at all. What seems most likely is that the SBC will continue to exist, but as a shadow of its former self. It will become smaller, more ideologically uniform, more concentrated in the Deep South and rural areas, older and culturally irrelevant. It will be the denomination your grandparents belonged to, a historical curiosity rather than a cultural force. Some churches will leave for other networks, some will simply close. The megachurches and influential congregations will increasingly operate independently while smaller churches cling to the SBC identity, even as the institution can offer them less and less support. The real tragedy isn't just institutional decline. Institutions come and go. The tragedy is the people harmed along the way. The abuse survivors who weren't believed and protected. The women called to ministry who were told God couldn't use them because of their gender. The young people who left the faith entirely because the institution claiming to represent Jesus seemed to embody everything Jesus opposed. The pastors who burned out trying to hold together congregations torn apart by culture war politics. And here's the final twist. Some of those people are finding faith again, but in new forms. House churches, multi-ethnic, non-denominational congregations, progressive Christian communities, Orthodox Christianity. Some are exploring Catholicism or mainline Protestantism. The death of the SBC isn't the death of Christianity in America. It's a reshuffling, a collapse of one form, and the emergence of others. Future historians will look back at the Southern Baptist Convention as a case study in how institutions die. Not from external persecution or sudden catastrophe, but from internal contradictions finally catching up, from prioritizing power over purpose, from protecting systems over people, from choosing to be right over choosing to be loving. The pews are emptying. The baptismal pools are seeing fewer and fewer candidates. The old hymns still echo in many churches, but the voices singing them are graying and thinning. This isn't a sudden apocalypse. It's a quiet collapse, visible only to those paying attention, as unstoppable as demographic math, and as final as the churches being sold off to become breweries and laser tag arenas. The Southern Baptist Convention will probably exist in some form for decades to come, but the institution that once shaped American culture, that put presidents in the White House and defined evangelical identity for millions, that sent missionaries to every corner of the globe and wielded enormous cultural power, that version is already gone. What remains is an echo, fading year by year, a monument to what happens when institutions lose sight of the very things they were created to preserve.